So, what can be done to improve research? There have been inhumane and actually utterly appalling ethical lapses in research, and more recent concerns over the replicability of many well-known studies in the field of psychology. And I'd like everybody to consider sort of what the various pitfalls of experimental design are that we've been discussing, including confirmation bias and other biases, placebo effects, nocebo effects, experimenter expectancy, reactivity, the fact that that you're in a research study and how that might change how you respond, and the lack of diversity in research faculty and participants in research studies as well. So again, what can we do to improve research? Well, some of these things seem, rather obvious, right? Like increasing diversity in faculty and also student populations and subject populations. But one important change, one absolutely sort of critical change, is the development of what we call institutional review boards, or IRBs, which invite not only research faculty but also members of the broader community who screen and evaluate all research proposals involving human subjects. An approved consent form must be a component of that review, listing all known potential risks. That's also a significant requirement for conducting any sort of human research. For animal research, there are even more extensive guidelines, a more complex set of guidelines, actually, and a more extensive list of guidelines and requirements, because animals are unable to provide consent. And the equivalent committee that reviews animal research at an institution is what's known as the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee, or the IACUC. And I put links actually here on our site to both IRB requirements and also IACUC requirements. Now, there's a couple of other additional aspects that makes research kind of fraught, and that need to be sort of considered and taken into account when we're proposing studies and trying to get past an IRB, for example. There is for example, the reliability of various measures like surveys or questionnaires or things like that, instruments that they use in psychological research, and reliability just means that there's good sort of retest. Like if you give this questionnaire once, and then you give it again, you're going to get sort of similar results. There's sort of consistency of measurement, basically. That's the reliability of the study. And one thing that they try to do to, another way they can sort of evaluate reliability is to have more than one rater of something. If they're rating, some behavior or rating something, they call it inter-rater reliability. They look at the reliability there, between different individuals who are rating the same circumstance, right, for a study. But then there's also validity, which is the extent to which a measure, actually assesses what it claims to be measuring, right? And sometimes this is like what we call face validity. It's kind of like obvious on its face, sort of valid. And, as a neuroscientist or somebody who comes from a biological psychology background, I think of things like, if you have a drug, that acts as an agonist, it acts like, the neurotransmitter, let's say norepinephrine, does at a specific receptor, on the heart or something, on its face, I would expect, the application of that drug or the administration of that drug to lead to increased heart rate. That's on its face, that's valid. But sometimes you need what's called experimental validity, which means you only sort of, validate it by experiment. For example, one of my favorite examples is apparently psychedelic drugs, right? Will provoke, powerful sort of visual hallucinatory experiences in people, but in rodents, you see a behavior, depending on how potent the drug is, how powerful. How efficacious, how powerful the effect. You'll see much greater what they call head sniffing behavior. There's like this intense sniffing behavior, which may relate to the the dramatic amount of olfactory processing in the rodents that are used in that sort of research. But the more that the rats or mice will do this dramatic sort of head sniffing, the greater the intensity of the psychedelic experience that people will tend to experience. And that's not like on its face clear. It's the validity of that test has been found through experiment. Um, Another thing that makes research kind of complex is how what's called the file drawer problem. Like, for example, if you don't find something, if your hypothesis is not borne out, if you have a negative result of some sort, oftentimes that's not the kind of thing that gets published, right? So if lots of people have tried to find something and they haven't, and it never gets published, well, then other people keep trying it, and then all of a sudden you might get some kind of a spurious result. You might get some kind of a like a positive finding, but if you take it in the context of many, 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 many efforts, to find this, and only one out of, let's say, 25 attempts, and the other 24 attempts are in a file drawer somewhere that nobody knows about. Well, that's not going to help in terms of in terms of the research that gets published. It's likely to be you're likely to have difficulty replicating it. You can contribute to the replication crisis in psychology. And then the last kind of point I want to make here is how we have to have random assignment of subjects to the experimental and control groups in an experiment, right? Very important. But the other thing is we've already got kind of a self-selected, narrow slice, of our overall human population, right? That we tend to be evaluating in psychological research. So according to one study that I post here, 68% of research subjects in a sample of hundreds of studies in leading psychology journals came from the United States, and 96% from Western industrialized nations. Of the American subjects, 67% were actually undergraduates studying psychology. So this is sometimes it's discussed as the problem of having all these weird subjects, right? Westernized, educated, from industrialized, rich democracies. So, I mean, random selection of subjects is key, but we're already sort of, to some extent, sort of self-selecting. So there's a lot to consider in research. I want you guys to consider this. I want you to, consider how we might best address some of these, issues that crop up in designing studies and, publishing work in the field of psychology.